Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host, your grateful host. We got a great program for you today. Second hour, Jimmy will be here. We're going to do weird questions with Jimmy Akin. Always a great way to spend a Friday afternoon. Maybe it's Friday evening where you are, maybe even a Saturday morning, depending on where you're listening, wherever it is. We're glad you're here. First hour, Dr. John Bergsma is with us, who has written beautiful books on the Bible and a very fine book. Actually, you probably have heard me mention it a lot of times because whenever this comes up, I always mention how good Dr. John Bergsma's book on the Dead Sea Scrolls is. So we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls today. If you got questions about first century Judaism, the Judaism of the time of Jesus or the time just before Jesus, you got a question about how that Judaism was lived out, how Jesus related to it, all of that. More than welcome. Maybe you got a specific question about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, if you're going to do one of those in scroll number 37b, then you're going to definitely be above my head, but we'll give it a try. The number is 888-318-7884. And I said I'm your grateful host, and because for two reasons. One, I'm only giving out one number today, and it's I am not good at multitasking, as you have probably noticed. Not my strong suit. So today the number will just be 888-318-7884. No fundraising phone number. And also grateful because of all the generosity of folks who really helped us out. And it was pretty clear, I think, during the 3 days of our fundraising that it was a bit of a struggle this time, which sometimes it is. And the heartening thing at those times is that there's folks that'll just pick up the phone and call and maybe they weren't even going to give this time, but they're like, well, they need it. And lots of folks did that and came through for us. I have no idea what the final number will be. We really can't know that until after the weekend because Darren is just very slow at math. So we'll once he gets his pencil sharpened, we'll figure it out and we'll tell you how it all went. I'm sure that it will be less than the ideal, but we'll muddle through and we'll figure it all out. So again, thank you for the generosity. I know many people prayed for us. They told us that as well. Lots of people called and just said lovely things, and lots of people. We say we struggled, but the other side of that is lots and lots of people picked up that phone or went on the website and gave to support this apostolate so that we could continue our work, which we think is valuable because we think people knowing Jesus is valuable. And there's nothing that changes a life for the better, ours, yours, anybody else's, than knowing Jesus. So thank you again for your support. Our guest this hour, Dr. John Bergsma, is a full professor of theology at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, which I'm guessing is probably under 9 or 12 feet of snow right now. Dr. Bergsma used to be a Protestant pastor for 4 years. He served as a Protestant pastor. He went to Notre Dame University to get his PhD, and he became Catholic in 2001. He's the author of a bunch of books, but let me list a few of them. A Catholic Introduction to the Bible, the Old Testament, Jesus and the Old Testament Roots of the Priesthood, and the one I mentioned before, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, Revealing the Jewish Roots of Christianity. Dr. John Bergsma, thank you for being with us.
Absolutely, Sky. Always a good time to be with you. And you're right, we're under a lot of snow here.
Yeah, and it was blowing too. That's what I saw. So good luck digging out.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yeah, you really sound like you appreciate that. The number is 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884. I may have used this idea before when I've talked to you about these things. First of all, I do talk about your book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot because I loved it. It was like just the most exciting, like little glimpse into the world that Jesus lived in. And it really is exciting. But it makes me think that in some ways we are so far from the society that Jesus lived in, thousands of years, generation after generation. But in some ways we're nearer now to Jesus than the people 1,000 years ago were, because they didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. They didn't have, these things. The Dead Sea Scrolls really do get us closer to Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a providential find. We can almost see the hand of God in it, because right in the middle of the 20th century, when in some ways criticism of the New Testament and criticism of the historical Jesus was at its height, with figures like Rudolf Bultmann, who just said that all the Gospels were fictitious and the only thing we could know about Jesus was that he died. Right while that is going on in scholarship, we discover this library of a Jewish monastery that was flourishing at the time of Jesus. And we recover documents that were literally written pen on paper while St. Paul was alive, while our Lord was alive, while the apostles were exercising their ministry and doing their thing in the land of Israel. And we find in the scrolls phrases that otherwise are only found in the Gospel of John, for example, or the epistles of Paul, and not in other classical documents and so on. So we find the context for certain theological terms and certain theological phrases. And that's such a wonderful evidence that the Gospels and the epistles of Paul are authentic to that time period that they claim to be from the first century, from the life of our Lord, pre-70 Israel. 70 is the big date because that's when the temple was destroyed and that was the end of an era. But this is clearly pre-70 Judaism, and we can compare it very favorably with the documents of the New Testament, giving us a lot of confidence in the historicity and the authenticity of these documents.
If you'd like to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Judaism of Jesus' time, 888-318-7884. Dr. John Bergsma, our guest, 888-318-7884. Things in the Bible that otherwise are very odd suddenly become kind of clear. At least they see. I got that sense in your book when you see them in the light of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, John the Baptist went out at 4 or 5 years old and lived in the desert till the time Jesus came. That doesn't actually make a lot of sense, but it does in the light of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah. So Luke 1:80 says that he was out in the desert. We're talking about John the Baptist, of course, out in the desert until he begins his public ministry. And, we're so used to it. Cy, those of us that have grown up in the faith, and you just think, well, that's what John the Baptist does. He grows up in the desert. So we don't sit down and think, what would that involve? And how would an adolescent or a child survive out in the Judean desert? Well, here we read in the Jewish historian Josephus that these monks out on the Dead Sea, out on the shores of the Dead Sea, would take in boys from the larger community and raise them in the monastery and form them according to their manners. And it's very interesting. Josephus actually uses the term form, just like we do in the Catholic Church today, to talk about formation, spiritual formation, human formation, and so on. So they formed these young men, and that's how they got many of their vocations. We can imagine that was probably orphans, or people sent their sons out there because this was a center of learning. They had a library of about 1,000 volumes. That's just mind-blowing for the day. This was an enormous center of learning. And so if you want your son to become a theologian, you want him to be a great priest, you want him to know the religion of Israel very well, you send him out to get educated by the monks. And this makes sense of what otherwise is just this throwaway line, is like, why would Elizabeth and Zachariah send this little kid out into the desert, to fend for himself and eat bugs and stuff? And no, that's not what's going on. He's going out and being raised by the monks.
888-318-7884, the number. Dr. John Bergsma, our guest. We're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whether you're Christian or not, whether you're Catholic or not, you're welcome to call with your question. If you have a question about those early years, those years when Jesus himself walked, and the years even before that, the formative years for the Judaism of Jesus' time, your question is very welcome here. 888-318-7884. So we know the Sadducees. We know something about the Sadducees. They come across very grumpy, frankly, in the New Testament. We know about the Pharisees. They come across as a mixed bag, the Pharisees. But neither of them are the people that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls.
That's right. Yeah, the Sadducees were grumpy because they didn't believe in an afterlife. and that can make you bummed out.
Yeah.
Okay, they didn't believe in heaven, and so they were sad. You see, I'm sure you've heard that one before. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I couldn't resist. Anyway, oldest preacher joke there is. So the Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife. Did not believe in angels or spirits. They only accepted the 5 books of Moses. That'll make you kind of grumpy if that's all your Bible consists of.
Right. It's a lot of rules.
Especially a lot of rules, and Moses is in a bad mood at the end and at the end of Deuteronomy. But that's the Sadducees. They controlled the temple. They were the chief priests. Pharisees were a scholarly movement, very uptight, trying to get everybody to live by these high standards of purity. We know of them because they're in the Gospels. Actually, the third group is in the Gospels as well. It's just that they're not called Essenes in the Gospels. But as well, I'm sure we'll get to later, we can see them at certain places in the Gospels if we know what to look for, the kind of manner and dress and custom and stuff like that. We can identify some Essenes. But Essenes, the name Essene was an outsider term. What they called themselves was Israel, or the repentant of Israel, or the many of Israel. And that's interesting because that phrase shows up at the Last Supper when Jesus says, "This cup is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." That was a little term that the many was similar idea to the church, and we can talk about that as well. But these Essenes were about the same size as the Pharisee movement, but they kept to themselves. They lived by super high standards of purity. They were waiting for the Messiah to come back at any time. They studied and prayed intensely. They lived poverty. They engaged in charitable works and works of mercy, and they also practiced celibacy and monasticism. So a lot of those features are similar to the early church. Not all, and there's some very important differences between them and the gospel and the church, but a lot of similarities too. And so it's really fascinating, and we got a ton of information about them from the historian Josephus, who writes pages and pages about their habits and manners and beliefs.
He's very impressed with them.
He is. He was a Pharisee, but he writes more about the Essenes, like 3 or 4 times more about the Essenes than he does about his own movement, the Pharisees. He was just like fascinated. He couldn't get enough of these guys, and then we got the remains of their library, so they can see what they think about themselves, and we can also see what outsiders thought about them.
Again, the number 888-318-7884. I would just keep talking to Dr. Bergsma all day, but there are folks on the line, and we will go to the phones. We've got to take a very quick break, and then we'll head back to the phone, or we'll head to the phones to talk to take questions on the Dead Sea Scrolls and that Judaism of the time of Christ. Right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catch Catholic Answers Live anytime at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
Wherever you are in the world, you can access the EWTN Global Catholic Network. It's everywhere. You can get EWTN's great Catholic programming on your car radio, at home on your TV, computer, or smart speaker. With EWTN's app, you can take EWTN everywhere on your phone or mobile device. If you want your news in print, turn to EWTN's paper of record, the National Catholic Register. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Our guest is Dr. John Bergsma, and I think people who listen know that I love all the things like Josephus, who was mentioned, and the writers like Ignatius and Polycarp that give us a window into early Christianity. Well, the works that Dr. John Bergsma is here to talk about with us, the works that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, are not Christian works; they're Jewish works, but they give us an unbelievable insight, view into the world that Jesus lived in. And if you have questions about them, you're welcome to call 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884. I got some more questions about the Essenes, but I want to get to the phone. So how about we do that, and I'll come back with my questions about the Essenes.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go to Ethan in Cincinnati, Ohio, watching on YouTube. Ethan, you're very welcome here. Go ahead with your question for Dr. John Bergsma.
God bless you too.
Oh, thank you.
Dr. John Bergsma, I really love your book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's one of the few books I've read that have made my jaw drop when reading it. You know what I mean?
This guy gets it. I had the same reaction. I love that book.
Yeah.
Yeah. My question for you is, whenever the Essenes are brought up, a lot of people will refute. Whenever the stuff about the Essenes is brought up, they'll refute it by saying, well, they were just a fringe cult that didn't really represent Judaism. What would you say about that?
I would say that's just historically not the case. Read Josephus. He's the first century historian. He was a Pharisee himself. He had no reason to exaggerate the influence of the Essenes, but he was fascinated with them and wrote pages and pages about them. He says that they were one of the three main schools of thought in Judaism. And he tells us that every town in Israel had a community of Essenes living in it. So this was no negligible group that can just be shunted to the side. Moreover, we've got archaeological record. We've got the remains of a monastery, a complex of buildings down on the shores of the Dead Sea that could house between 100 and 200 men. We know it was inhabited for about 200 years, and their library consisted of over 1,000 very well-written religious texts, including the oldest copy of a biblical book that we have in our possession. And a library of 1,000 scrolls in first century Judaism, that is a major center of learning. They were a force to be contended with in the first century in the Jewish context. Josephus talks about the influence of some of their leaders and their prophets. A general from the Essene group was part of the military staff that fought against the Romans in that final battle. So again, this is not a fringe group. This is a very important branch of Judaism.
What do you think, Ethan?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Very good. All right, well, pick your jaw up, Ethan. Appreciate that call. The number is 888-318-7884. I'm going back to calls, but let me just lay this one on you real quick. Was John the Baptist show the signs that he was an Essene himself?
He's not an Essene. Well, he's preaching, because the theology of his preaching, as recorded in the Gospels, is different than Essene theology, but has many striking similarities with it. My view, and I argue this in my book, was that he was raised in the community, and that explains a lot of the similarities that he has with the Essenes, but was either left or was kicked out and branched off on his own. So he has important differences with them as well as important similarities.
Again, Ethan, thanks. We're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. John Bergsma is our guest. We go now to Aurora, Illinois. Mark, listening on 97.5 FM. You are very welcome. Mark, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. I've often speculated jokingly that the reason the Bible doesn't tell us much about Jesus' childhood is that God wanted the Freudians to keep their hands off.
Well, that's certainly a positive side effect. Whether that was the intention, that's a good side effect.
Well, the historian Paul Johnson has guessed that a lot of the content of his parables reflects jobs, you might say, that Jesus did before he entered into public ministry. So the shepherd parables, for example, or the parables about architecture. And I just wonder, do the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us anything about Jesus' childhood and early manhood that we hadn't known directly from the texts themselves?
Yeah. Nothing explicit. They do give us a picture of the beliefs and expectations of Jews in the time of our Lord. So, for example, the sermon at Nazareth that we see that Jesus begins his ministry with in Luke 4, that is really, really interesting because Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because it anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's what Jesus reads there in Nazareth. And that text was associated by the Essenes with the return of Melchizedek, the priest king, from Genesis 14. They believed he was going to return someday and proclaim a year of Jubilee that would free people from the power of Satan and from the debt of their sin. Because, of course, the Jubilee year freed you from slavery and freed you from your debts. But this is going to be a spiritual Jubilee. And so it's just fascinating that Jesus, as a young man beginning his public ministry at, say, age 30, chooses that text to announce in his hometown. And Nazareth looks like it was a sympathetic town to the Essenes because archaeologically we can determine that they practiced farming in an Essene manner. That was discovered only about 2 years ago. We could talk about that if you want later, how they found that out. But Nazareth looks like it was sympathetic to the Essene movement. And so when Jesus announces Isaiah 61, he is, and that it's fulfilled, he is suggesting that he is this Melchizedek, this priest king that they were expecting. And then he backs it up by casting a demon out of a man later in that same chapter. That's freeing people from the slavery to Satan. And then the following chapter, he forgives a man's sins when they lower that paralytic down out of the ceiling in front of him. So he's doing the things that the Essenes expected the end times Melchizedek to do. And that's part of the reason why the word about him just spread like wildfire. And we keep reading in the Gospels about how everybody was going out from all the towns to go out to see him, because this guy was doing what they were expecting, these famous supernatural characters and prophecies to actually deliver on.
What do you think, Mark?
I find all of this very fascinating. I might add that I assume that Paul Johnson, the historian, was a Christian because he talks in this little biography of Jesus about how he learned the Bible at his mother's knee and how he attended Sunday school as a boy. And he would tend to support the notion that Jesus was a stonemason because of the parable imagery about the cornerstone and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, yes. And that's interesting with the Essene movement. When we look at the archaeology of Qumran, they were very skillful. They didn't put a lot of effort into making their quarters very elegant. But when we see that when they wanted to do something well, like make an aqueduct or a ritual bath, they were very expert stonemasons and plasterers and extremely skillful. So it's an interesting kind of connection there.
Mark, thanks very, very much for the call. We're talking with Dr. John Bergsma. Among his books is Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I think our last caller, Mark, captures it. It is exciting because, you think about Jesus and his preaching, and I remember even thinking as a child, like, well, how did he even get started? Like he didn't, and you think about these guys who get up on the street corner and preach, and everyone just ignores them. But Jesus is actually answering immediate expectations of the community. And we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The community is expecting certain things. The things he does perfectly match those, Sometimes by perfectly, I mean they're also he's modifying them, but he's showing them who he is, and so it's immediate. They recognize who he is in the things he does.
Yes, absolutely, and to have documents that confirm these expectations, and you see this kind of like hand in glove fit between Luke and the expectations expressed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we know were copied in the first century. And you got to say, hey, the gospel really fits the lifetime of Jesus.
888-318-7884. Hey, callers, hang on the line. I really am going to get as many of you on as I can. It's such an exciting topic. We have this new, by new, I mean just, in the last century, this look into the world of Jesus. Your call's welcome. 888-318-7884.
Have you enrolled in the Catholic Answers School of Apologetics? Let me ask you a more important question. Do you believe as a Catholic that you have an obligation to share the Catholic faith? In fact, the Church has answered this question, and the answer is that all confirmed Catholics are obliged to share the faith. It's actually in canon law. Catholic Answers is here to help you fulfill that obligation. Our School of Apologetics courses will equip you to help all the people you come in contact with understand what the Church teaches and why. A great place to start is with all the Catholics in your life. Learn the art of apologetics from the best of the best and start sharing the gospel today. Visit schoolofapologetics.com. That's schoolofapologetics.com. Here's a question. Is it really possible to be friends with someone who died 2,000 years ago? Maybe the problem is that we've grown way too comfortable with the story of Jesus. Nice man, right? Taught us to love one another, said not to judge people. We celebrate his birthday every year. It's time to put away this small, safe version of Jesus, says Cy Kellett. Nobody that bland could have transformed the world. In A Teacher of Strange Things, Cy presents Jesus Christ undiluted by sentiment, with all his radical words and deeds uncensored. Do you know someone, your son or daughter perhaps, or maybe your mom or dad, who needs the friendship of Jesus Christ? Do you? Order your copy of A Teacher of Strange Things by visiting shop.catholic.com today or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Did you know you can access Catholic Answers Live right from your phone or other mobile device? Download the Catholic Answers Live app today. The Catholic Answers Live app, available now on iOS and Android.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Our number is 888-318-7884. Second hour, we'll do weird questions with Jimmy Akin. That's always fun. And this hour, we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of my favorite things to talk about because I love John Bergsma's book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can get it wherever good Catholic books are sold. You can probably get it where bad Catholic books are sold as well. But it's a good one. It's an antidote to all those other bad Catholic books. You'll love it. It's just a fun, exciting read. But if you want to just talk to Dr. Bergsma, you're welcome. 888-318-7884. Scott from Texas called, and he just asked, he said, could you just tell us what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? So maybe we went a little quick there at the beginning. I get excited about this topic, and maybe you could just tell us what the Dead Sea Scrolls are.
Sure. So there's this intense religious movement among Jews, starting maybe in the middle of the 200s BC, where they're breaking off and started to pray together and seriously prepare for the coming of the Messiah. And this group becomes a movement, a religio political party that is called the Essenes. And we know of them from the ancient Jewish historian who goes by the name Josephus, who was a contemporary of St. Paul, and describes them. So anyway, one of the things they did was establish what we would think of as a monastery on the shores of the Dead Sea, perhaps around 150 BC, and that monastery was inhabited right up until the time Jerusalem was destroyed around the year 70 AD. And during that time period, at all times, between 100 to 200 celibate men, monks, okay, lived at this community, and they prayed and they studied the scriptures and worked and did the kind of things that monks typically do in other religions. And they collected a library of over 1,000 scrolls. And either, for whatever reason, they stored that library in the caves that surrounded their community, perhaps to protect them because maybe they feared that the Roman soldiers were coming. And their community was wiped out by the Romans, but they left us this library hidden up in those caves, all these scrolls in jars. There, like I said, the remains of over 1,000 scrolls were found. A quarter of those were Old Testament books. 3/4 of them were religious writings of every kind that you would expect to find in a monastic library. So you got commentaries on Scripture, you've got prophecies, you've got lectionaries, you've got liturgical calendars, you've got discussions of canon law, all these kinds of things in this library, all reflecting the practice of this first century Jewish group.
Scott, I'm glad you called and asked, because it was great to take a minute to do that. Just in reference to the biblical books there, my understanding is that the book of Isaiah is complete, and that it is by maybe 800 or 1,000 years the oldest copy of the book of Isaiah. Am I in the ballpark on that?
Yes. One of the first scrolls that was found is what we call the Great Isaiah Scroll, and it's a complete copy of the book of Isaiah in nearly perfect preservation, at least when it was found. It's aged a bit since because it's gotten exposed to oxygen, but it was in a perfect state of preservation, dating perhaps back as far as 250 BC, at least by the carbon dating of the leather. And this is older by about a millennium than any complete copy of a book of the Old Testament in the original language that we had previously. Previously, we only were back as far as maybe the 900s AD in terms of a complete Hebrew copy of an Old Testament book. And here, with this discovery, it was in 1947 that some Bedouin shepherds stumbled into these caves. With that discovery, we jumped back a millennium in terms of our witness to the biblical text. And especially important apologetically, because this places our copies of these Old Testament books before the rise of Islam. And of course, we know that one of the critiques of Christianity that comes from Islam is the idea that Jews and Christians have contaminated or altered the text of Scripture. Well, these are pre-Islamic texts of the Old Testament in the original language, and they testify to the fidelity of the copying of the Bible over the centuries, because there are not significant differences in these copies over against the copies we had before, which only went back to the medieval period.
So preserved as the book of Isaiah, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years span between the two copies, and virtually the same book. I mean, with the kind of errors you would expect, that someone just wrote this wrong or something. But yeah.
Yeah, a wrong letter, a switched word, things like that occasionally. But yeah, but very much, absolutely recognizable as the complete book of Isaiah.
Bill in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, watching on YouTube. You're next, Bill. Go ahead with your question for Dr. John Bergsma.
Yeah, hey, Cy.
Hi, Bill.
Thanks for taking my call. Also, Boston College grad, and I'm still Catholic. So
me too. We did it. We got through, and we're still Catholic. Dr. Bergsma went to Notre Dame, and he became Catholic.
So
the Holy War.
I got to say, I had good Catholic professors there, and I'm grateful to them. I joke about it, but I'm very grateful to the teachers who helped me with my faith.
That's great.
I actually had a class with Peter Kreeft there when I was there. So
He is from the same Dutch Calvinist background that I am, and he converted 50 years, almost to the year before I did, but from the same college, same alma mater, same Dutch Calvinist background as Peter Kreeft.
Well, we need more Dutch Calvinists then, because I only know two of them, and you guys are great Catholics.
Yeah, we make great Catholics when we convert.
Bill, I'm sorry, we're chatting, but go ahead with your question.
No worries. So my question was, so Paul converted maybe in 35 AD. Who knows? And Dr. John, you said Josephus was a contemporary of Paul. Is there, and then there was a 14-year gap where Paul, after his conversion, kind of went away and prayed. Is there a chance that he was part of the Essenes?
Yeah, that's interesting. I do not think he was part of the Essenes, but it is interesting that there are some phrases from St. Paul that are not found in other ancient literature except in the Dead Sea Scrolls. For example, the phrase works of the law, which is a very important phrase theologically in Romans and Galatians, because St. Paul says we're not saved by works of the law. We actually find that same phrase in a scroll that scholars call on the works of the law. It's usually called actually 4QMMT, which is a Hebrew acronym and a bit of jargon, to identify the scroll. But it's basically a letter that discusses ritual laws of Judaism, and it refers to these ritual laws as works of the law. And also that same document from the Dead Sea Scrolls uses the phrase reckoned as righteousness, which of course is very significant in Paul's argument in the book of Romans, where he talks about Abraham being reckoned as righteous because of his faith. And this document, by the way, happens to be a letter discussing the proper observation of Jewish rituals that the Essenes at Qumran, at their monastery, wrote and sent up to the Pharisees up in Jerusalem to try to persuade the Pharisees to come over to their way of doing things, their way of interpreting Moses's rituals. And so Paul, being a Pharisee, probably read this letter at some point. It was kind of like high-level ecumenical dialogue between the two movements. And so we see that Paul's language really reflects first century Judaism and the concepts that were going around. And I would say that the Dead Sea Scrolls really verify what Thomas Aquinas had always proposed about understanding Paul, because Paul says that we're not saved by works of the law, but then in Romans 2, Paul says it's the doers of the law who will be justified. And so how do you reconcile that apparent contradiction? And Aquinas said, hey, works of the law refers to ritual laws, and but just the law generally is the law, the love of God and love of neighbor. And so that's why Paul treats those two different ideas differently. And then in the Dead Sea Scrolls, sure enough, we find works of the law being used as a term for ceremonial, ritual observances, and not for moral laws or the Ten Commandments and so on. And so it kind of verifies what Augustine's intuition, what Aquinas' intuition was back then. But Paul was a Pharisee. I think he had discussions with the Essenes, but did not join that movement.
Okay, Bill?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you. I'm just trying to figure out what Paul did for 14 years.
Yeah. He prayed.
Yeah. Not a lot of childhood stories in the New Testament. Well, I shouldn't say childhood in that case, but thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate the call and the question and the shout out to Boston College. But I love Bill's question because it opens up just another reason why this is such exciting stuff, that you have these phrases in the New Testament that appear nowhere else in the ancient world, and then these documents from out of the ancient Judaism appear among us, in this century, that use the same words and phrases. It puts the whole Christian. Well, first of all, it helps us in like, as you said, apologetically, to say, look, these New Testament documents are quite reliable. These reflect the way that Jewish people spoke at that time and the way they thought. But also, it just gives us a sense of this vital community of expectation for the Messiah that was all over the Jewish world and that Jesus did actually fulfill.
Yeah, absolutely. They were waiting for him. Another thing, Cy, is we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls that another expectation was that they were going to get both a royal Messiah and a priestly Messiah when the time of fulfillment would come. And if you look at how the Gospel of St. Luke is written, Luke does not begin with the Annunciation and the birth of Jesus. It begins with the Annunciation and birth of John the Baptist. And it's very clear from Luke 2 that John has this very good priestly lineage through his father Zechariah. And so I think what St. Luke is doing, among many things, he's writing to a broad audience and many different demographics. But one of the things I think St. Luke is doing is, for those that were looking for a priestly Messiah, he really holds up to you John the Baptist from the line of Levi, from the sons of Aaron, from the sons of Zadok, who is this extremely holy, ascetical priest prophet who is amply qualified to pass the baton on to the royal Messiah, who is Jesus of Nazareth. And of course, we get his royal genealogy there in Luke 3. So it just, that's tremendous to me, because it shows that Luke is writing for his contemporaries and showing that Jesus answers their expectations.
888-318-7884, the number if you want to talk with Dr. John Bergsma about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll recommend the book again, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before we go to a break, and we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back. Joseph in Lincoln, Nebraska, you'll be first up when we come back, and then we'll get to the other callers. The early church was the Catholic Church. If you're a convert, then chances are it was a study of the early church that started you on your way. The hands down, the best book on the early church can be gotten right now for as little as $3 a copy, because they've got it in bulk sales now. The early church was the Catholic Church. Get it for your parish, get it for your group, distribution for just $3 a copy. Visit Bulk Books at shop.catholic.com and order your bulk copies of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church.
This is Archbishop Paul Coakley, the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and you're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Do you love praying for people? Have you ever wanted to use your gift of prayer to share Jesus with others and build up the body of Christ? Start a public prayer station with St. Paul Street Evangelization. Listen to people's needs, pray with them, or invite them to meet you at church. St. Paul Street Evangelization can help you get started. Find out how at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
He was a Jesuit, a cardinal, and a doctor of the Church.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Robert Bellarmine is honored for his immense contributions to theology, including helping to draft 2 important catechisms that defended church teachings during the Protestant Revolt. Pope Clement VIII named Bellarmine a cardinal because, as the Pope put it, Bellarmine had not his equal for learning.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. Having just a great Friday. I hope you are as well. Maybe it's Saturday morning where you are. If you're on the other side of the date line, hope you're having a very nice Saturday morning. Our guest is Dr. John Bergsma. The book is Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The number, if you want to participate, 888-318-7884. But Dr. Bergsma, unless you have an objection, I'm going to do what I said was going to do and go to Joseph in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm taking no objection. Okay, Joseph in Lincoln, Nebraska, listening, of course, on Spirit Catholic Radio. Please go ahead with your question for Dr. Bergsma.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. In light of the Dead Sea Scrolls finding, I'm interested in your viewpoint on textual variant types found at Qumran and your viewpoint on Jesus and the apostles choosing the Septuagintal text type, like majority of the time. And I'm not talking about like Greek writings, but Hebrew writings that are in line with the Septuagint.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question and a very technical one too. But the reason why we have the Septuagint translation typically being quoted in the documents of the New Testament is, of course, because the apostles and the apostolic men who wrote the New Testament were writing for the broadest audience possible, which was a Greek-speaking audience, and Greek was the international language of its day, just like English is today. I mean, if you go to the land of Israel today, you can make it through most places by speaking English, because most people speak a second language. If you're down bathing in the Dead Sea on the beach and you've got Russians and Chinese and Filipinos and American tourists, the common language is English, and it was Greek back in the first century. So the widely known Greek translation of the Old Testament that was already centuries old and very revered is what typically the apostles and the other authors of the New Testament quote from when they are showing that Jesus fulfills the Bible, fulfills the expectations of the Old Testament prophets. Now, as far as Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, the fact of the matter is that about 5% of the Old Testament books that we discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls actually follow the variations that you find in that ancient Greek translation known as the Septuagint, which was begun about the year 250 BC. And that revolutionized Old Testament scholarship. Why? Because for a long time it had been believed that the differences between the Greek translation of the Old Testament used in ancient times and the Hebrew that we had was the result of bad translation. And suddenly we discovered, no, it was not bad translation. The Greek translators did a good job. They just had different Hebrew texts in front of them. And so what that shows us is that the books of the Bible circulated in ancient times, sometimes in longer and shorter editions, just like books in English do today, kind of longer and shorter editions of, say, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And sometimes the longer edition is preserved in the Hebrew tradition, and sometimes the longer tradition is preserved in the Greek tradition, but there was some variation. But the Greek translators were responsible. The differences actually go back to the underlying Hebrew, and that is very interesting indeed.
Joseph, thanks very, very much. I appreciate you waiting so that we could get to you. We're talking with Dr. John Bergsma. We're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you've got questions about the light the Dead Sea Scrolls shed on Jesus and his ministry, on John the Baptist, on the apostles, on the early Christian church, or on the first century in general, you are welcome to call 888-318-7884. Going to Arizona now. Scott, listening to EWTN on Channel 130, Sirius XM Satellite Radio. You are up next, Scott. Go ahead with your question for Dr. John Bergsma.
Hi, thank you for taking it.
Happy to.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can just fine. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. I had recently come across a gospel reading in the last couple of weeks in reference, I think it was Mark 4, I think, in reference to Jesus talking about the parables and how some of the parables, he explained and to his disciples, and things were not hidden, and then some things were hidden, so that some would not be converted. And at first I'm like, whoa, like Jesus didn't want some people converted, and I know he came for all. So I had to ask a priest, what he thought of that, and he had said that Jesus basically was fulfilling a prophecy somewhere in Isaiah that spoke about, that there may be, I'm not sure if it does speak, I'm just trying to find out if it is in Isaiah where Jesus was referencing there will be some that don't hear and some that don't see, in order for the prophecies to be fulfilled, that he would be condemned to death and crucified. And so I didn't know if you can help me with that connection, or if there is a connection to somewhere in the book of Isaiah.
Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Bergsma.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question, and it's absolutely right. Yeah, what we're referring to is Isaiah 6. This is Isaiah's call vision, and God asks, "Who shall I send?" Isaiah steps forward, so to speak. He's taken up in a vision in the heavenly court of God, and Isaiah says, "Here I am, send me." And God commissions him and says, "Go and make the heart of this people dull, make their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed." And that is Isaiah 6, verse 10. And what this is a kind of a divine reverse psychology, because there's a lot of irony and paradox about this. Isaiah says, he's saying that God sent me to go and make your guys' eyes blind and make your ears deaf so that you don't hear God's word. But he's telling them that that's what he was sent to do. And he's writing this down as his prophetic book, and he's publishing it so that all the Jews can read this, the Judeans can read this, and so they read, "Oh, did you know that Isaiah was sent to make us blind and deaf so that we won't listen to him?" So it's meant to kind of arouse a reaction, and you're like, "Oh yeah, that's why you were sent? Okay, well, I'm going to listen to you just to spite you." You know what I mean?
That's funny.
It's that kind of thing, and so it's not really that God intends that people don't listen. Of course, there are going to be people nonetheless who won't. But it's kind of a very provocative way of communicating that that catches your attention and maybe even makes you a little bit angry, but it certainly forces you to think about what's going on here. And of course, Jesus and the prophets as well. All the prophets communicate in very provocative ways that are designed to arouse emotion and grab attention. Certainly Ezekiel does in his book. I mean, look at Ezekiel 16 or 20 or Ezekiel 23. It's R-rated stuff. It's like, whoa, this is in the Bible, and it's like, wow, yeah, this is to wake people up to the message. And our Lord too said very provocative things like, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, and if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. This was completely in keeping with this aggressive way of grabbing the attention of the listeners that was part of the prophetic tradition. And yes, that reference to Isaiah 6 is made, the passage I'm most familiar with is in Matthew 13, but it also occurs in the parallel of Matthew 13 in Mark, because of course Mark and Matthew have many parallel passages, of course.
Hey, thanks very much. I appreciate that call. I hope that was helpful to you, Scott. It certainly was helpful to us here. That's fascinating stuff to talk about. I tell you what, Dr. Bergsma, I love your writing. I love the way you write, and I tell everybody all the time, whenever they ask me about Dead Sea Scrolls or any of that, I say you should read Dr. John Bergsma's book, the Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I asked you, and I only got 30 seconds for you to answer this. If John the Baptist wasn't a scene, what about people who say Jesus wasn't a scene?
Yeah, there's no strong evidence for that, but there is strong evidence that he spent part of the last week of his life before his death and resurrection with the Essene community. Because when he goes into Jerusalem, he sends Peter and John to find a guy carrying a jar of water. That was women's work. Typically, the only guys that carried water jars didn't have women in their community. So that guy was probably celibate. Only Essenes practiced celibacy. Probably an Essene that led them back to the upper room.
Oh, fascinating stuff. We could probably do a show just on the garments of linen when you talk about the Essenes and their linen garments. So we'll do that another time. Dr. John Bergsma, author of Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thank you so much. A wonderful hour.
Yeah. Thank you, Si. It's been great to be on with you.
All right. God bless you, and stay healthy while you're digging out. Take a break every now and then, digging out of that snow. Jimmy Akin coming up. We're going to do weird questions with Jimmy Akin. That's always fun. We'll be right back to do that right after this on Catholic Answers Live. music makes me so happy. I really like that music. I really like it. That's the music for Jimmy, Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin, written by some gentlemen who were just kind enough to send us a beautiful theme song with theremin in it as requested. And it was just a very kind thing to do. And Jimmy Akin is here with us for Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Hi, Psych Hellet.
But speaking of weird, though, I don't know. They're not exactly synonyms, weird and mysterious. But what's on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World today?
This week, we're looking at the apparitions of Our Lady of Kibeho in Rwanda in Africa. They took place back in the 1980s. And this week, we look at the apparitions themselves. Next week, we look at the genocide that followed after the apparitions, and we look at the evidence from the faith and reason perspective about the apparitions.
Very good. All right, Our Lady of Kibeho today on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
This is the only approved African apparition, by the way, so check it out.
Oh, really? That's interesting. But how far back does this approving of apparitions go? Like, there's no, like they weren't doing this in the first millennium of Christianity, were they?
No. I mean, bishops would make statements about apparitions that were reported in their territory, and obviously if someone has like a heretical apparition, they always would have denounced that.
Right. I see.
But in terms of the modern system of approval, it's more recent than that. I believe it goes back a few centuries. One of the key works on evaluating private apparitions was written by Pope Benedict XIV, and it's still used today as a key resource. He actually wrote it when he was a cardinal before he was pope, but it's a fascinating read, and these days the process is governed by a set of guidelines that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published in 1978.
Ah, gotcha. All right. Well, Jimmy, weird questions are submitted to us through various means, but they don't come to us over the phone. And one of the things about when people ask weird questions on the phone is they tend to underestimate how weird we're willing to go.
Yeah.
So
true. Also, they tend to think things are weirder than they are.
Yeah, right. That's right. So the great benefit of doing Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin and getting the questions prepared beforehand is we know they're pretty weird. We got some weird questions coming up.
Yep.
Ready to take one?
Absolutely.
I'm going to try to read. There's some big words in this one. I'm going to do my best. Perspicacious parent asking a question originally posed by Brendan. Whichever of the standard folklore approaches one takes to fairies, it seems like it would be unusual for a fairy to be baptized, which in turn opens up some interesting questions about what's going on with Cinderella having a fairy as a godmother. Oh, I like this. Maybe there's an order of fair folk who returned to the faith, were baptized, and do good works on behalf of mortals. They're probably also suspected and persecuted by the institutional church. But Cinderella's family is part of the remnant which maintains a connection with them. Maybe this also has to do with why the stepmother treats Cinderella badly. The stepmother is an outsider and suspects what's going on in the family history, and she's putting pressure on Cinderella to try to make her renounce her pietism. Which, of course, makes it extremely dodgy to have someone with a fairy godmother marrying into a royal family. There's going to be some resistance to that. Is there reconciliation? Is the country placed under interdict? Why don't the stories address this stuff?
Okay, so Cinderella is a folk tale, and as a result, there have been bunches of different versions of it. In fact, Cinderella seems to be one of the oldest folk tales, and variations on it occur across multiple different countries and cultures, including, I mean, not just in Europe, but all the way over in like China. And so it's had a bunch of different variations, and it's not always a fairy godmother. Fairies are sort of a European concept, at least the idea of a fairy godmother would be, because that's where Christianity spread, and you have godmothers in Christianity. But in other versions, it's not a fairy godmother. But in terms of the ones that do have a fairy godmother, there are a few interesting things to say. So perspicacious parent asks on behalf of Brendan about how the royal family would be involved here. You know, if Cinderella had a fairy godmother and was marrying into the royal family with Prince Charming, and then also the church. Well, I don't think the church would be interested in persecuting fairies. The church is interested in sharing the gospel with everyone it can, and if a group of people, whether they're fairies or not, wants to be baptized, the church is going to be on board with that. It's going to want to evangelize those people. Similarly, I don't think a royal family is going to have a problem here because according to various accounts, and there are many different accounts of fairies and what their culture is like, but according to some accounts, they are kind of a military aristocracy. And if I'm Prince Charming and I need to defend my territory and things like that, I would want allies who are a supernatural military aristocracy that could help me out. I mean, who wouldn't want immortal warriors capable of performing magic on your behalf? So I think that that actually a royal family would be very interested in having alliances with fairy folk. In terms of it being unusual for them to be baptized, the tradition is actually mixed on this. If you look in compendiums of fairy lore, this meaning like not just made up books by modern authors, but ethnological, folkloric surveys of what people have believed about fairies. Fairies actually, and their related, cousins, trolls and dwarves and things like that, actually seem to display a rather significant interest in being saved. There are numerous reports of these magical folk coming to humans and asking, is it possible for us to be saved? And they get very upset if you tell them no. There also are, there also are accounts of fairies confidently asserting their expectation in salvation through Christ. And so there are traditions that go the other way, but it's actually mixed. So I guess it might depend on the group of fairies you're talking about. If you're interested in reading about the kind of folkloric study of fairy lore that I mentioned, a book you might want to check out is called The Fairy Faith, meaning the fairy belief or belief in fairies, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by W.Y. Evans Wentz.
Thank you. A good weird question to start with. We don't get a lot of questions about fairies, and I appreciate it, and I hope that Brendan especially is satisfied with that answer. Not going to give out the number because it's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin, and I got a bunch of weird questions to read to him. I'll do that right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Miss a show? Make sure to catch up by downloading the podcast, available online at Catholic.com.
The Aquinas Writing Advantage program is part of Homeschool Connections' set of online courses for your Catholic homeschool. Homeschool Connections' website is homeschoolconnections.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
He was a doctor of the Church and one of the greatest defenders of Christ's divinity.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Athanasius of Alexandria fought against the Arian heresy that questioned the divinity of Christ. He once condemned the Arians as opposers of Christ who had dug a pit of ungodliness. It was said of him, Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, but for Christ. He died in 373.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
There's the Weird Questions theme song. Perfect, because we're doing Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. Welcome back. All the questions have come to us via the internet or similar things. Are there things that are similar to the internet? I don't know.
The ARPANET, that was the predecessor of the internet that was developed by, and I'm blanking on the name now, the Research and Node Development Corporation. Anyway, yeah.
I'm pretty sure you have it, Jimmy. You probably have the ARPANET on your computer. I just feel like Jimmy Akin would have that. Whatever it is, it's on there.
Probably still ways of accessing it.
This one comes from William.
Okay.
William has a few questions.
Oh, the RAND Corporation.
Oh, was the RAND Corporation that did it?
Well, I believe so. But it was the ARPANET, which led to the internet, was developed as a piece of Cold War technology because they were concerned about if nukes start dropping on America, they could knock out telephone communication systems. And so they wanted a system that would route the messages around the holes that had been punched in the communication network. And that led to the development of email packet technology, where the email gets broken up into different packets that find their own way to the target using whatever routes are available.
That is cool. And all of that led to me wasting a half hour every morning when I get to work, going through things that I should...
videos.
Yeah. I have a few questions. This is William. I have a few questions regarding the Soul Gem, one of the 6 Infinity Gems of the Marvel Comics. Of course you do, William. Don't we all? Here, I am specifically referring to the comic version versus the film version. I do not know how much you know about the Infinity Gems, so here is some important background info. They were created as part of the universe in the Big Bang. Each allows for complete universal control over a different aspect of the universe: power, space, reality, the mind, the soul, and time. Finally, the questions. I'll just do them one at a time for you. All right?
Okay.
The soul gem can warp and unwarp the soul. This means it can forcefully make beings evil or good. Thanos says, I can turn sinners into saints and saints into monsters. Question: what effect does this have on free will, the need for God's forgiveness, and purgatory?
Well, it would seem that it would override free will, at least to a very substantial degree, so that your free will options, if you have any at all, remain constrained in, or can be constrained in, a very narrow range. So that if you had someone who was a saint, and you use the soul gem on them, it constrains them to making choices that are primarily evil, or vice versa. And what that will do is change the person's, from God's perspective, is change the person's level of culpability. Because if someone doesn't genuinely have the freedom to choose good over evil, then the person is not culpable for making the evil choice. And so it would be like someone has a brain tumor that causes them to become a murderous psychopath. They're not responsible for their behavior because they didn't choose to have the brain tumor. And so in the same way, if Thanos gives you a spiritual brain tumor that makes you evil, God is not going to punish you for things that you were not responsible for choosing. Reward and punishment are based on the degree of freedom you have and how you use it. So saints turned monsters will not be punished except for what freedom they had, and vice versa. Sinners turned into forcible saints would not get credit for things they didn't actually choose freely. In terms of purgatory's function is to cure disordered desires. And if the soul gem was used to give you disordered desires, then purgatory could still clean those up. So let's suppose you're a saint and Thanos turns you into a moral monster. Well, you're not going to go to hell because you weren't responsible for the evil you did, but the soul gem may have left you with disordered desires toward intense evil, and purgatory would be capable of taking care of those.
All right. William also asks, the soul gem can resurrect the dead. Thanos says, and the dead, their souls are also within my control. Question: if someone was in heaven and was resurrected, could they theoretically end up in hell after they die a second time? What about going from hell to heaven?
It depends on the degree of freedom that they are brought back from the dead with. If they're brought back from the dead and have no freedom, then the state of their soul would not change. Even if they did good things in life, but with no freedom, they would still go back to hell. or even if they did bad things in life but with no freedom, they would still go back to heaven. On the other hand, if they're brought back from the dead with genuine human freedom, then yes, they could change their destiny. And that actually coheres, or would cohere, with other situations that we know about. I mean, if you think about Lazarus, okay, he was brought back from the dead, and he was a good person, so presumably he was in heaven or on his way there, being cleaned up in purgatory. But let's say Lazarus comes back. He's functioning as a normal human with normal human freedom. If he decides to reject God and commit a lot of mortal sins, well, even if he went to heaven the first time he was dead, he would go to hell the second time he was dead because he freely chose evil. And the same thing would happen with the widow of Nain's son. Let's say we don't know that he was a good or bad person, but let's say he was a bad person and he was in hell. Well, when he gets brought back to life by Jesus, the widow of Nain's son could say, wow, I don't want to go back to that place. I'm going to repent, at which point he would go to heaven. And in fact, if you study the literature regarding near-death experiences, or NDEs, this is where someone clinically dies and comes back, many people report very positive experiences when they were clinically dead, but some come back and report the opposite. They say it was bad, and that motivates them to change their lives. In fact, I have a relative who had an NDE, who came back and concluded he was not living the way he should, and he needed to clean up his life as well. So that's something that is reported in other fields.
William, thank you for the. No, there's one more. Sorry, I didn't realize. Another question from William on the soul gem that Thanos uses in the comics. Could the soul gem fix original sin?
Original sin is the deprivation of sanctifying grace. So if the soul gem were to be able to fix original sin, it would have to be able to supply someone with sanctifying grace. On the other hand, a consequence of and I don't know of any evidence that it does that. That would be up for Jim Starlin, the comic book writer responsible for all this, to determine does it function that way. On the other hand, it would seem like the soul gem is capable of affecting one's desires, and so it might be able to help with the disordered desires that we have as a result of original sin. That would presumably be involved in turning a sinner into a saint, so his desires would change so that they're no longer morally disordered.
Now I will say thank you, William. William, you definitely got the idea. As a matter of fact, our first two callers were quite clear on the idea of weird questions with Jimmy Akin. Ask your weird questions, and there's pretty much not a limit to how weird it can get. This one comes from Dominic, and thank goodness, a little relief from all the speculation. We're going to talk about something real, the Borg. Dominic asks, what would happen to your soul if you were assimilated by the Borg? Let's assume that the cybernetic implants and the nanoprobes keep your body alive indefinitely. You are never killed and you are never rescued.
Well, in terms of what would happen to your soul, in some ways this is quite similar to what happens with the soul gem, because the Borg override your free will. And so as a result, the state of your soul would become fixed in whatever state it was when you fell under the control of the Borg and lost your free will. It's kind of like, to give an earthly analogy, it's like if you're walking down the street and one day you have a stroke that causes you to go into a coma. Well, you don't have freedom when you're in the coma, and so the state of your soul is whatever it was when you had the stroke. If you were in a state of grace, you remain in a state of grace. If you were not in a state of grace, you remain outside of a state of grace. And the same thing would happen with your soul if the Borg assimilated you. If you were in a state of grace at the time of assimilation, your soul would remain in a state of grace no matter what they forced your body to do. And if your soul was not in a state of grace, then you would remain not in a state of grace until Judgment Day when Jesus returns.
All right. Dominic, thanks. I was kind of hoping that answer would be longer, Jimmy, because I don't want to read the next question. I don't want to do. Tom, why did you do this to me? Why did you?
Braveheart, Cyril.
All right. By the way, if you are offended by the word poop, please change the station now. Tom asks this: Before the fall, did
you want me to read it for you?
No, I'm going to do it. I'm getting paid for this. I got to do it. Before the fall, did Adam and Eve have to poop? And if so, would their poop have been stinky? Or would they have had perfect poop? Or would they not have pooped at all and the digestion was perfect with no need to poop? Tom, thank you. God bless you, brother. Appreciate that question.
So the way that Genesis presents Adam and Eve before the fall, it doesn't give us a sense that they were possessors of superpowers. Now, there has been theological speculation that they had superpowers, and you would need something like superpowers in order to be able to avoid the need to expel waste. Total conversion of matter to energy is something that is normally achievable only by colliding matter and antimatter together. And since the human body does not naturally contain antimatter, the human body would not normally be capable of total conversion of matter to energy. And as a result, of it not being able to do total conversion, there will always be a residue of matter that is left over after the body has extracted what energy it can from our food. And that residue needs to be gotten rid of. And so unless they had some really amazing superpowers that we're not told about, then they would have needed to poop. And presumably it would have been just like it is today. There would have been microorganisms that would have gone to work on the detritus and caused it to emit an odor.
Tom, thank you very much. Are you all in the booth? Are you laughing at me or are you laughing at the question? Because it's feeling like you're laughing at me.
They're not laughing at you. They're laughing near you.
Yes. I've never been so just viscerally opposed to the word residue before in my life. Tom, thanks for the question. This one comes from Jill. It's weird questions for Jimmy Akin this hour. Okay. Jill asks, is it possible to validly baptize an unborn baby? I'm thinking of an instance where maybe the mother is dying and the baby is not developed enough to survive outside the womb. If it is not possible, does the reasoning implicitly contradict the church's teaching on life beginning its conception? If it is possible to validly baptize an unborn baby in emergency situations, then what about non-emergency situations? It seems like it would be a good idea just in case something happens before the baby is born.
So it is possible to baptize unborn babies, and in fact, it has been done. It is sometimes done when there is a danger to the child who might not survive to birth. In fact, it's been done for more than 121 years. And the reason I say that is because 121 years ago, in 1901, the Holy Office, which was the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time, issued a reply to a bishop who was asking when, not if, when we baptize unborn babies, can we add a small amount of the disinfectant mercury chloride to the baptismal water? So like 1 part in 1,000 to prevent infection. And the reply from the Holy Office was yes. When you baptize unborn babies, you can use a 1 to 1,000 ratio of mercury chloride in the water to help prevent infection. Now, the reason, or one of the reasons it's not done commonly, is because we haven't been used to doing it historically, because it would have been impossible to do it safely before the development of modern medicine. And even today with modern medicine, it still poses some risk and to both mother and child. And so it's not commonly done, but it can be done. And as medical technology improves and as our awareness of pregnancy and the humanity of the unborn has improved, it may become more common in the future. In fact, I've thought about writing science fiction stories where it's normal in the future for people to be baptized before they're born.
Thanks very much for the question, Jill. I appreciate it. It's weird questions for Jimmy Akin. And as you can see, if you got a weird one, you're welcome to send it. You can always reach us here. radio@catholic.com is our email address. And Edgar, the new guy, will get it. radio@catholic.com. Or there's lots of ways people contact Jimmy Akin as well if you want to use one of those ways. And then we'll put a little group together and Jimmy will answer the questions. And sometimes you do weird questions on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, too.
Yeah, sometimes for Fifth Fridays, we use our Weird Question show over on Mysterious World.
Mysterious World today, Our Lady of
Kibeho.
If you're interested, the only approved apparition of Our Lady in Africa. Hear what Jimmy has to say about it at Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Right back with more weird questions.
Here's a question. Is it really possible to be friends with someone who died 2,000 years ago? Maybe the problem is that we've grown way too comfortable with the story of Jesus. Nice man, right? Taught us to love one another, said not to judge people. We celebrate his birthday every year. It's time to put away this small, safe version of Jesus, says Cy Kellett. Nobody that bland could have transformed the world. In A Teacher of Strange Things, Cy presents Jesus Christ undiluted by sentiment, with all his radical words and deeds uncensored. Do you know someone, your son or daughter perhaps, or maybe your mom or dad, who needs the friendship of Jesus Christ? Do you? Order your copy of A Teacher of Strange Things by visiting shop.catholic.com today or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you. Have you enrolled in the Catholic Answers School of Apologetics? Let me ask you a more important question. Do you believe as a Catholic that you have an obligation to share the Catholic faith? In fact, the Church has answered this question, and the answer is that all confirmed Catholics are obliged to share the faith. It's actually in canon law. Catholic Answers is here to help you fulfill that obligation. Our School of Apologetics courses will equip you to help all the people you come in contact with understand what the Church teaches and why. A great place to start is with all the Catholics in your life. Learn the art of apologetics from the best of the best and start sharing the gospel today. Visit schoolofapologetics.com. That's schoolofapologetics.com.
Did you know you can access Catholic Answers Live right from your phone or other mobile device? Download the Catholic Answers Live app today. The Catholic Answers Live app, available now on iOS and Android.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Catholic Answers Live.
A little bit of weird music. Fun weird music for Jimmy. I always want to say Jimmy Akin's Weird World, but that's not it.
It's Pauline Dakin's Weird World.
Is there a thing called Pauline Dakin's Weird World?
Well, in essence, Pauline Dakin was a Canadian woman who grew up with some very strange things.
I listened to that episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Now I know who you're talking about, the Weird World. Yeah, right.
Exactly. And she later was told that the reason that so many strange things happened when she was growing up is because she was being protected from her father, who was an organized crime leader, and that in Canada there is a whole secret organized crime protection service called the Weird World.
Yeah. That's one worth listening to. There's a lot of good episodes. You all should check it out, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. But that's not what this is. This is Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live, and more weirdness to come. Here we go. Todd ask this, Jimmy. What criteria would the Catholic Church have to consider if someone wanted to marry an alien? And then there are lots of sub-questions, so maybe I'll do those one at a time. What do you think?
Yeah.
All right. Mm-hmm. Would the couple have to prove they can consummate the marriage?
Well, I don't know that the burden of proof would be on the couple, but one way or another, it would have to be proved that they are capable of consummating the marriage, because in order to have a valid marriage, you have to be able to consummate it. If it's not possible to consummate it, if there is, as the canon law says, antecedent, perpetual, incurable impotence, then it won't be a valid marriage. So you do, even if you choose never to consummate, you have to have the ability.
Okay. Would they have to come up with some way to prove that they are the equivalent of the opposite sex? Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Again, I don't know that the burden of proof would fall on the couple to prove this, but anymore, I mean, presumably biologists would be able to look into this and so forth. But in essence, yes, because you can't have two persons of the same sex marrying each other.
What if any child they bear might have severe disabilities because of mixing species?
Well, if there really are genuinely different species then that have no relation to each other, then they're almost certainly not going to be able to produce children. That's a common way, actually, in biology of characterizing species, of if they can produce fertile offspring together, then they're the same species. But if they're not capable of producing fertile offspring together, then they are different species. Now, that's an approximation, but it's a commonly used one. However, if the human and the extraterrestrial were able to produce children together, then the fact that the child might end up with birth defects would not determine the validity of the marriage, because there are humans that marry each other and they have genetic predispositions that will result in birth defects for their children, sometimes certain birth defects. I mean, it will happen. If this person has a child and they have a dominant gene, not a recessive one, but a dominant gene that causes a birth defect, then at least 50% of their children will have that birth defect. And if they have two copies of the birth defect causing gene that's dominant, then all of their children will have the birth defect. But that doesn't stop them from being able to marry. Now, it does affect the question of, is it reasonable to have kids, or should we have kids? But it doesn't affect the validity of the marriage, and so it wouldn't affect the validity of marriage between a human and an extraterrestrial.
And finally, from Todd, to that end, the church is against bestiality. So would they have to come up with some criteria to distinguish human from beast?
Yes, the church would. And the classic definition, going back to Aristotle, for what a human being is a rational animal. And so if you're an animal and you have the gift of reason so that you can think like a human, then you would count as a human being. And that got applied at times in church history to thinking about extraterrestrials. And so you would have various Christian and Catholic thinkers saying, okay, well, if there are rational animals on other planets, then whatever they look like, they're humans. By Aristotle's definition, they're humans. And so you would need a criterion or set of criteria to determine, is the extraterrestrial a human or a beast. Now, these days, we tend to not use Aristotle's definition in biology. In biology, we tend to use a set of criteria that are based on DNA. And presumably, the alien would, if they didn't have deoxyribonucleic acid, the specific genetic information carrier that terrestrial life uses, presumably they'd have something else that carries genetic information down through their generations. And so that would make it look very much like they're not a human by a biological definition. And so the church would ultimately have to come to a conclusion about which kind of definition predominates. Is it the biological definition or the more philosophical definition that would govern this question? And that's a question that the magisterium has not yet considered.
Thanks, Todd. Weird questions for Jimmy Akin this hour. Up next, a weird question from Anne. Why do all representations of the cross depict the corpus with a wound on the right side when the heart and pleural sac are on the left? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Would blood and water gush forth from the right side when a spear pierced?
So I'm not an art historian, so I don't know the answer to this question for sure, but I suspect that it may be due to the influence of the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin, after it became well known in the Middle Ages, it had a prominent influence on Christian art. And on the shroud, the spear is depicted as going through, at least this is what I've read according to a recent study that was made of the shroud. It depicts the spear wound in such a way that the spear would have gone through Jesus's right lung. And artists could have seen that maybe in the early days when the shroud was more vivid than it is now, because it's 2000. Depending on your estimate, it's between 1,000 and 2,000 years old, and things fade. Images can fade over that time. So it could be that that back when it was first becoming well known in Europe, artists noticed that, the spear wound seems to be on the right side of the man on the shroud, and so we're going to depict Jesus that way. In terms of would blood and water gush forth from the right side if Jesus was pierced by the spear on that side? I think the answer is yes, and there are two possible explanations for that. Now, first of all, I should mention the water in this case is really like blood plasma where the blood is coagulated due to heart failure, and so it separates out into this clear substance that looks like water and this darker reddish substance that looks like blood. And that will collect either in the pleural cavity around the lungs, or it will collect in the pericardial sac around the heart. And so the spear could, and actually I guess there are three ways that you could explain this. The first one, if the blood and water is in the pericardial sac around the heart, and Jesus's heart is more on the left side than the right side, because hearts are not really on one side or the other. They're kind of in the center, but they lean to the left typically. One way you could explain it is if the spear goes in deep enough to get all the way to the pericardial sac, and then when the spear comes out, it opens up a channel allowing the blood and fluid from the pericardial sac to flow out on the right side. Another possibility is that the blood and plasma was not in the pericardial sac, but just in the pleural cavity around the lungs. And in that case, when the spear goes through his right lung, it creates a hole into the pleural cavity, and when the spear is withdrawn, it allows the blood and plasma from the pleural cavity to flow out. The third option is that Jesus had a condition known as situs inversus. In situs inversus, the ordinary positions of the internal organs are flipped. And so instead of Jesus's heart being central but primarily on the left, it would be central but primarily on the right. And in that case, then the spear coming in through his right side would have had easy access to the pericardial sac around the heart, allowing the blood and plasma in the right-sided heart pericardial sac to flow out.
Wow. All right. Thanks very much, Ann, for that very interesting question. There's more weird questions to come. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Right back after this.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
We have a big problem. Our culture is dying, and souls are in danger of being lost. The answer is conversion to Jesus Christ in His church. St. Paul Street Evangelization is a Catholic organization, and we have hundreds of teams spreading the good news throughout the country. But we need your help. The harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Find out more and get involved today at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
Beyond Damascus with Dan Demite and Aaron Richards is our show for young adults.
Everybody's talking about encounter. Everybody's talking about that mountaintop experience. What we fail to often talk about is what happens after what happens beyond that Damascus moment?
Jesus Christ is calling all of us to be missionary disciples, disciples of Jesus who are on mission to bring the kingdom of God here and now on this earth.
Beyond Damascus with Dan DeMatte and Aaron Richards, tomorrow at 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
I want that to be my alarm clock music. I would like to wake up to that. It would be better than the thing I have right now.
That can be arranged.
Can it? Is there some way to do that?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I mean, if you have a smart alarm clock like an Alexa device or something like that, you can tell it to play whatever you want for your alarm.
Can my iPhone do it? That's what wakes me
Yes.
up right now, my iPhone 8 with the back cracked.
Yep.
All right. That's cool. Maybe I might have to get one of these tech people to show me how. Hey, I'm not taking calls right now. We're not taking calls right now. Catholic Answers Live. All the calls have come to us already via the internets and like. And Jimmy Akin is our guest, and it's weird questions for Jimmy Akin. So if you're like, I always wanted to hear a great Catholic apologist just answer the weirdest questions, well, you just stumbled upon the show for you. Linda asks this: do you think time travel would cause an alternate universe?
I think yes. I think that's the most likely explanation. Now, if we're thinking about time travel where you have somebody in, let's say, the year 2022, and then they go back, they just kind of jump out of time and go back to the year 1922. So they appear in 1922, even though they weren't alive then. That's kind of the classic image we have when we're thinking about time travel.
Yeah.
You would confront what's known as the grandfather paradox. And basically, let's say your grandfather is alive in 2022, but your father is not. Well, if you kill your grandfather in 1922, your father will never be born, and therefore you will never be born. And if you're never born, you wouldn't be able to go back to 1922 and kill your grandfather.
And you're really mad at your grandfather. Maybe deal with the family issues. Don't go through time travel and kill him. I mean, come on.
Certainly that's one option.
Okay.
But suppose someone is so mad at their grandfather they want to kill him.
Okay.
Well, in that case, we'd seem to have a paradox where if you go back and do this, then you can't go back and do it. So how could we conceive of time travel given the possibility of this paradox? There are two principal explanations. The first is that there is some kind of chronological protection principle that will prevent you from being able to kill your grandfather so that the situation never arises. And this would also exclude all similar paradoxes. But it seems very hard to imagine how that would be. I mean, if you go back to 1922 and you're a normal functional human being, you should have the ability to point a gun at your grandfather and pull the trigger and have the gun work. It would seem to require really strange sets of coincidences to be able to prevent that from happening if you were determined to do it. And we don't have evidence that the universe contains mechanisms to cause those kinds of coincidences to happen. So that leads us to the other interpretation, which is that when you go back to 1922 and insert yourself into the situation there, which you were not originally in, then you are essentially causing the timeline to branch. And so you're now in an alternate timeline. And if you kill your grandfather, well, it's true, your father will never be born, and therefore you will never be born in this timeline. But we don't have a paradox because you're not from this timeline. You're from a different timeline where your grandfather lived, and so you got to live, and then you came here and caused a new alternate timeline. And to my mind, that's the if time travel into the past, the way we think of it, typically is possible, I think the branching timeline or alternate universe explanation is the most sensible one. Now, there are other ways that you could conceivably travel into the past that also wouldn't result in paradoxes, but they are not what we classically think of as time travel.
Yeah.
Like merely rewinding your timeline and then living it all again forwards with no changes. That's not really what we mean by time travel.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for that weird question. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's weird questions for Jimmy Akin. Christy asks this. Now, it appears that deathbed visions are a thing that is distinct from near-death experiences and hallucinations. What implications do these discoveries have from a faith perspective?
Well, they're very interesting. Now, they don't affect the substance of the faith because, as Jude points out, the faith has been delivered to the saints once for all. So they're not going to tell us anything new about the faith. But there's no reason from the faith perspective to dismiss them. We know that in various cases, we know it's possible even for people to come back from death. That happened with Lazarus. It happened with the widow of Nain's son. Presumably, they might have been able to report some of their experiences. And it also happens, as we mentioned, with near-death experiences where someone is clinically dead and then comes back and they can report on their experiences. And we have all of these accounts of people who are either dying or in danger of dying, and they begin to experience these visions. These are very well documented. They happen very frequently. In fact, an uncle of mine who just died recently, a few months back, when he was also having an encounter, he didn't actually die that time, but he was having an episode where he was in danger of death, and he began to report having deathbed visions. And my aunt was there to talk to him about it. And interestingly, the content of the visions faded in his mind after a few days. He could remember the gist of what he saw, that it was really good and really beautiful, but he could no longer remember the details after a few days. In any event, we have this widely reported phenomenon, and my attitude is we should take phenomena at face value until you have reason to question it, until you have evidence that it's not what it appears to be. And in these situations, they are distinguishable from ordinary hallucinations. I mean, not in every single case, but broadly speaking, they are distinguishable from regular hallucinations. And so I would say they should be understood as what they appear to be. They're some kind of communication with the afterlife as a person is approaching death, either directly by God's grace or through something natural that God has built into human nature, or through the initiative of spirits on the other side, like angels or departed loved ones. There's some kind of information transfer between what's on the other side of life and death from what's on this side, and people are able to have some experience of these things that I don't see any reason to question it for being what it presents itself to be, which is a glimpse into the afterlife.
Christy, thanks. Very good question. I appreciate it. Brian asks this. It's weird questions for Jimmy Akin. Brian asks this. If heaven is not a place, as some theologians claim, how can there be two bodies there, of Jesus and Mary?
Well, okay, so notice the premise. If it's not a place. So that's what we're starting with. The theologians who advocate this view will tend to point out, and it's actually a kind of related to another somewhat more sophisticated view. The more sophisticated view says the essence of heaven is spiritual union with God, but that doesn't mean there's no place where you and your body exist when you're in spiritual union with God. And so that, to my mind, is the logical explanation. Even if there's no specific region that is called heaven, if you are in perfect spiritual union with God, wherever your body is, you can be said to be in heaven, because the essence of it is being in spiritual union with God, not being in a particular location. And there's then another possible view, and I don't know, this may be advocated by some theologians, though I don't know any particular ones off the top of my head, who would simply say there is no spatial location that your body is in at all when you are in spiritual union with God. I don't know anybody who would say that. And if someone did say that, I would be skeptical of it, because it is a matter of biblical teaching and church teaching that we do continue to have our bodies in the resurrection, and that Jesus and Mary have their bodies with them now. And so that would mean that wherever they are, even if matter is not stretched out in space and time the way it is in our universe, wherever they are now is at least capable of receiving matter and keeping it together in some form so that it remains a single body for Jesus and a single body for Mary. So it may or may not have the dimensions that we do. The physics there may not work the same way, but it's at least capable of receiving bodies that are native to our universe.
Thanks, Brian. This one comes from Tom. According to Professor Hawking, we can't have free will if there is no God. He said that since we are purely material beings, all our thoughts are nothing more than brain chemistry. But brain chemistry is controlled by the laws of physics, not by us. If we have no control over our thoughts, then we never make any choice. However, when we examine what goes on in our heads, we know that we do in fact make choices. Question, isn't this then compelling evidence for the existence of God?
Well, I tend to be rather strict when I'm looking at arguments for the existence of God, and I try to test them pretty rigorously. And in this case, it seems to me that this would be better configured as an argument that more than mere matter exists, because we do have the experience of free will, and it doesn't seem obvious how we would have free will if our brain functions were purely the product of matter. And so putting those two things together, matter doesn't seem to explain free will. Nevertheless, we have evidence of free will. That would, to my mind, suggest that we have evidence that there is more than matter. But that doesn't mean specifically God. It's consistent with the existence of God, but I wouldn't say it proves the existence of God. I think you can prove God's existence on other grounds, like why is there matter to begin with? But if we're just looking at this argument from free will, I would say it gives us evidence that there is more to reality than just the material.
Thank you very much. Let me just remind myself who that question was from. That was from Tom. Thanks very, very much. Appreciate the question. I'm going to go to, do we have time? Yeah, we got time. I'm going to go to Joe. In terms of the theory of infinite possible futures, are there any infinite numbers of past timelines, or if all possibilities combine into one single past timeline? Do you understand that question?
Yeah. So there are an infinite number of ways things could go in the future from this point forward. And there are therefore also an infinite number of things that could have led up to the current state of things in the cosmos. So God knows an infinite number of things that could happen from here on out, and he knows an infinite number of things that could have led up to now. Now, what evidence might we have from a scientific perspective that any of those would be real? Well, actually, there has been some thought given to this in the physics community. In the 20th century, there's a very famous physicist named Richard Feynman, and he pointed out that if you that in calculating the probability of where a particle will end up when we take a measurement of it, kind of the best way to calculate that is to think of every possible trajectory the particle could have taken to get to that destination, and then do a summation of those different trajectories, and that gives you the best estimate. This is known as his sum over histories model, and on some interpretations of quantum mechanics, all of those different paths actually happen. And we, in the present moment, are sitting at the sum of
all the possible pasts and all the possible futures.
Well, all the possible paths.
I got you.
Led up to now.
I got you.
Now, there's more to say about that, but there's the music, so we may have to talk about that more on a future show.
Well, that'll be fun because that's an interesting question and lots more weird questions to get to next time we do Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. As I said, you can always just shoot us an email, radio@catholic.com, or reach out to Jimmy, one of the ways you're already in contact with him maybe. Jimmy Akin, thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's always a lot of fun. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here, Catholic Answers Live.